Today we're going to do a fairly loose little painting of some flower blossoms, and I wanted to keep it very impressionistic. I'm not a botany person. I'm not, one of these people that does the real realistic things. I like to keep it very loose and flowing and fluid. But we're going to use negative shapes for our blossoms. And I was telling some of the folks earlier that were waiting, before we started, that you can create any kind of flower this way. It's a technique that we'll do today that has many different applications. But I think it'll be a fun way to do it. And we'll start with just basically blocking out three blossoms. We're going to use the rule of three. We don't want to do two blossoms because that's an equal number. We don't want to have a single one, then it becomes a bullseye. But we'll create three that are different in size and proportion, one of which will be our primary or dominant focal point, which is the center of interest. And the other two are kind of supporting. And then all of the foliage and the leaves and the shadows and things that are around these, we will use as a device to create some really nice rich darks to push up against the white negative shape of the blossom to make the one negative shape that's our focal point really pop and be dramatic. And then we'll go down and we'll do to a lesser degree the other two blossoms. So if Lois, if you can spotlight my drawing or my painting at this point, we'll switch and so talk about it. What we've got is I've got three blossoms that I've identified, and I haven't given you a drawing because I wanted to keep this pretty loose. I don't want you to get too rigid in your interpretation here. But basically, we've got three different segments of the blossom. You can see, and this is a hibiscus, but I've given it quite a bit of jagged edges, kind of choppy, rough edges. See if we can get that down there so you can see it pretty well. Just to give the edge treatment a little variety. But then what I've done is I've created a next size down in a little less definition, and then the lower one is even less defined. And what we'll do is once we get these established and drawn out, these three blossoms, we'll end up glazing over some of them and softening some of the edges and kind of losing some edges in a few places. But our main concern will be up here in our primary blossom at the top, which is our focal point. And you can see I've come in with some really strong darks, and I'm going to take you through this whole process of how to soften those dark edges as they move away from the negative shape and just sort of blend into the shadows. But to get started, what we want to do is I'll pull away this painting here, and I drew in very loosely. Where's my pencil here? These three segments of the blossom. And you don't have to really define these all that carefully, but if you want to go ahead and just start drawing it, I elected to get this kind of up high in my painting and off center. And then these other two are kind of staggered as they come down, but the entire blossom part of this painting is in the upper quadrant, the upper left quadrant. And I will leave a lot of lighter values and lesser developed space in my painting in this part. One of the things that I want to do is I want to take a warmer approach with some of my background tones. And I'm going to put in some very pale transparent tonality that's a little bit warmer. And then as we proceed down towards the bottom of the page gradually, everything gets cooler, less defined. I don't know if anybody's heard of the term of deconstruction, but I want to almost make this painting start deconstructing. So we'll see a hint of a couple of leaves without giving it a lot of definition. We want all of our definition to be around these three blossoms, and we'll have some warm leaf shapes and some cool, but then everything that goes down beneath these blossoms, if the sunlight is coming from above, gets cooler and cooler, and I'm going to use more cool tones, cobalts, and so forth. I'm going to back my camera up a little bit so you can see everything. My setup here, I've got my palette to the right, water up above. I'm right-handed, left people who are left-handed, I encourage you to put your palette and your water on your left side so that as you move back and forth with your hand and your brush, you're not trying to go all the way across to get your stuff and your pigments and your mix and dripping all over your painting. So there's some thought there to that. The other thing that I'm going to use today is a misting bottle. I use these little misting bottles that, and they don't last forever. Sometimes you have to get new ones, but you try to get just sort of a cloud of mist coming out. You don't want to have it squirting really hard, because what this does is it'll take the pigment that you might put on your paper that's very delicate, and then it'll just diffuse it, and it becomes a very almost like wet and wet tone without having to wet the whole paper and go through the drying process. So it's a useful tool. In some of my previous critiques that we've talked about, I think many of us have a tendency to try to make it dark, and it doesn't get dark enough. So we go back in and try to darken it after the pigment has started to soak into the paper. And then all of a sudden we get kind of lose our transparency. It takes on a more of an opaque characteristic. And I've mentioned in my critiques that if you take a squirt bottle or a misting bottle like this and give just a half squirt to where your paint is, you're trying to get a dark to stay dark, it will lift some of that pigment back up off the surface so that it's flowing across the top of the surface. And that's where you're rejuvenating the transparency. And it eliminates or helps prevent it from becoming opaque. So just a little tip there. I know that that's something everybody struggles with. We all do. It's sort of characteristic of watercolor that if you overwork it or you go in and touch it too many times with a brush in one shape, it looks muddy and overworked. And this little misting bottle is a wonderful tool to rejuvenate and lift that pigment away from the surface so that it flows. And when pigment is flowing in the water on top of the paper, that's when all the pigments kind of mingle and mix. And as they dry and the water evaporates, you get this luminescent, glowing quality in your dried or drying results. So just a little tip there. All right.
I've got a couple of queries. Can somebody have a more of a close-up on the drawing? And also, those people who have made a drawing, what do they do about their pencil lines?
Well, I would take a kneaded eraser like this and just kind of lighten up any of the other lines. You can leave the lines around these three blossoms if you've already delineated those with a pencil. I think it's helpful to have those at least defined. I've given myself a few little light guidelines. I'm going to go back to my painting here, and I've defined a few of these leaf shapes that I know are going to be positive shapes. But most of the stuff that's on the lower two-thirds of the painting, I've tried not to draw too much, because your pigments are going to be very transparent and very light in value. So as you run that light valued paint over a pencil line, it's going to be locked in and visible. And so that's why I try to keep it really light so that it has more of a spontaneous look to it. We want to plan our spontaneity, but at the same time, we want it to look real fresh and not be labored with a drawing. But where you have these negative shapes for the blossoms, we're going to be pushing really dark pigment up against those. So any pencil line will be obscured and never be visible. So go ahead and define your pencil line around these blossoms. And you can see I tried to take one segment here, one segment here, and one segment here. And my plan is I want to leave parts of these pure white of the paper. And by really going dark around them, that white just becomes brilliant. Whereas if I take a little mid-tone of cobalt or something, drag it across a couple of these edges and lose some edges, they become less obvious, and they're not quite as strong, and they're almost like a little bit of shadow from adjacent leaves. As you get farther down into the structure of the painting, we want to leave a little bit of the white visible and unadulterated with other pigment. But then we're gonna, on the back side of these blossoms where they're kind of receding back into the shadows, we're gonna take some of this mid-tone pigments that we'll be applying, and with a damp brush, we'll just kind of soften the edges, pull it down right across those negative shapes. But in order to do that, we have to define these three negative shapes. So to start with, what we're going to do is take some very light cobalt blue mix, kind of a glaze, and we're just going to kind of outline or paint around these. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to back out so you can see my palette. I'm going to mix up some cobalt. I just make a nice mixture that's like a glaze. You can see it's pretty wet and pretty diluted, but it's got enough pigment in it that it's going to stain the paper as we go around it. And what I want to do is just in a couple places, I don't even need to go up quite up to the pencil line. I just want to establish the shape. And I do that, rinse my brush, and I can then just push down on the heel of my brush, the shoulder of my brush, and just push that cobalt blue glaze up against the pencil lines. And I'm not leaving an outer edge. I'm just feathering it away so that all we see is suddenly we've got some dark up against the light negative shape. Rinse your brush, push a damp brush up into that dark shape, and you see how it just feathers away? And all of a sudden, we very quickly define the shape of that blossom. And I can kind of move my way around. There's a big bead of pigment sitting on the surface of the paper like that. I'm gonna just put a little bit over in here, not much, rinse my brush, and just push up that damp brush that's clean up against that puddle of pigment and let it filter away and just stain the paper a little bit. And it's just tinting the paper with some tone. And I'm trying to eliminate any edge that's on the outer, outer away from our negative shape. I'll come back after this dries and we'll add greens, we'll add some really darks. But right now, what we're doing is helping ourselves be able to see the shapes that we're trying to define. Try to push my phone down here so you can see a little better. We'll do the same thing here. I'm just gonna just push my tip of my brush in and around the edge shape to define it, rinse my brush, and then just kind of wipe the brush off, and then just take that whole brush and push it down on the paper and just push up against those dark residue that I've pushed up against the negative shape. And what we're doing is very gently defining our negative shapes. And this is not by any means a finished painting. We're just doing some definition work here is all we're doing. And really kind of defining the shape that we want to preserve and protect as a white negative shape by creating a tone around it that helps us see it. And it really will be to our benefit to be able to realize how this looks, as we start working into this painting. It'll also help us preserve the white because we can see it now. We can really understand that that is sacrosanct. You cannot get into that white negative shape of the blossoms because that's what we have to protect. And then I would just clean your brush, wipe it off, and just feather away that blue where it starts to dry. So you don't see any really dry lines. You're just seeing tone, but it really starts defining the shape of what we're after. At this point, if you haven't got it drawn, go ahead and finish drawing it and then do this. I'm going to dry this so that we're ready to go on to the next step, but you've got to have it dry before we go on to again. So I'll stick my hand in the way of the camera here with a hairdryer and just dry this a bit. And if I see where something is starting to get an obvious definition where the tone is drying, I'll just come in and feather away that edge with a clean brush. And it works really well so that it just becomes a nice tone. And that tone is what's holding the shape of our blossoms. So any questions at this point? I think everybody needs to be kind of defined. I don't go out too far with the blue. I'm just kind of surrounding to these negative shapes with a little cool tone that helps it give it
You want to
definition.
say a bit about your brushes, Randy?
Yeah, what I started to talk to some of the folks about earlier is I use a Perla brush by Escoda. Um, Interestingly enough, I order these on Amazon. They're about $47 and you get three of them. And you get a number 8, a number 10, and a number 12. But they have a beautiful crisp point. They're a synthetic brush. I think the price is around $10 a brush if you break it out per brush. And they're amazing workhorses. I think I've used the one, here's an old one that I had ordered about 3 years ago. And it's still fine, but I got spoiled. I wanted to get some new ones, so I ordered two more sets of them. But I use them all the time. And the synthetic part of it, they've come so far with the synthetic bristles. They hold a beautiful point. They blend your edges, they soften your edges, they do everything but hold a lot of water. For a brush that you want to have hold a lot of water, I would use a mop brush like this. And I have a whole series of sizes of these, but I find with plein air painting and working in this scale of paper, which is a quarter sheet, some of the smaller ones are probably better. If I happen to work with a large format painting, I'll use a much bigger mop. But for these smaller paintings, they work really well. Um, and then I have riggers to do a little detail work. I didn't haven't even dipped this in the water yet to get the point sharp, but I have a nice long bristle on this rigger, and this is more of a liner brush. It's kind of a calligraphy brush, but I use this for a lot of the little detail work, which we'll do later when we get into the detailing of the blossoms. Um, Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an explanation. I'm going to back the camera up a little bit here. And we're going to put some tone up in this upper right corner and then a little bit of tone down in the lower left corner. And I'm going to use a big brush. I'm just going to take a big flat that I have and keep it kind of wet. I'm just going to just throw a little bit of water on there and pick up a little bit of a leaf green. Here, you can kind of see it's a very warm, light green value. Maybe add just a touch of this cobalt teal turquoise uh, tur or horizon blue, depending on what brand you're carrying. But you can see it's a nice warm um, green. And I'm adding a little bit more water to it so it isn't quite so intense. And I just want to go and just give kind of a little bit of a warmer tone out here in this part of the painting. And I might even add a little bit of yellow ochre to that, just to warm up the paper. There we go. And then just to keep it so it doesn't have a hard edge, I'm going to take my squirt gun and just mist it and let it just kind of soften and run away from the edge. Take a tissue and just kind of wick some of this away from off the edge of the paper. And all I've done is put a very nice uh, kind of warm tint to that paper. I'll take a little bit more of this yellow ochre, drop a little bit of that through there, just a little explosion of warmth. And these will be background colors so that we don't really have to worry too much about where they go, what they do. We're just trying to tint the paper. And I want to do this.
Randy, can you tell me what the leaf green was again, please?
Um, it's a like a golden green, a leaf green. Different manufacturers call it different things. I don't remember which brand I've used. I used to use a Steve Quiller. I think it was golden green, but he doesn't make that anymore. So I've switched to I believe it was Holbein's, and it might be golden green or leaf green. I'm not sure, but it's just a very warm, light value of green. Um, Cadmium green light sometimes is a little more lime colored, but sort of in the same value. But as it dries, you barely even notice it. Just the paper just feels a little warmer up there. Then what I'm going to do is go in the opposite direction with the same cool that I used around the blossoms. I'm going to pick a little bit of that up and just kind of throw a few little strokes down low like that on my paper. Not much, just a couple of little strokes, and we'll let that sit there and just dry by itself. And while we're letting that dry, I'll let you guys kind of finish that up. I'll take my little Perla synthetic brush, and I can soften some of these edges if I need to, just so that it just isn't real obvious. It's almost like a ghost mark there. You're ghosting in some very subtle brush strokes. This whole painting is going to go from light to dark in a progression. We'll use our lightest values, and then we'll get progressively darker and darker. Now that this is starting to dry a little bit, I'll use that same pigment that I've got in my palette, that's the leaf green or the golden green, get that on my brush, and I'm going to come back down and just put one or two more strokes off to the side there. This is, again, a little bit up towards the upper part of the painting, which would indicate light is coming down from above. And then as we get down into the shadows beneath this whole arrangement, everything gets a little cooler. So you're seeing a progression here of warm to cool. And then, of course, the negative shapes of the blossoms will be pure white, where the strongest light is hitting those. And then even within them, there'll be a little bit of shadowing. So at this point, check your paper, make sure it's dry. Mine is still pretty wet, but you don't want to try to rush it. If you get too hard of a line, you don't want to, any uninterrupted long straight edge kind of attracts the viewer's attention. And in this case, we don't really want to do that. So I'm going to come back in and take my brush and just erase that edge. And it just blends into the background very gently. And you don't, all you just have is a feeling of warmth versus cool without really seeing any edge work. I'm going to put this old tape under here to get it the same angle. And I think you can kind of see how this is starting to get a little bit warmer up here, get a little cooler down here. Now I think it's going to be time to start developing some leaf shapes. And these leaves up here are in sunlight, right? So they need to be a little warm. But how do we create a change from warm to cool across a leaf? You've got to have a little bit of water in there. You start with a warm shape. I'm going to take some burnt sienna and just kind of create an edge to this leaf. Clean my brush and just tickle the edge of that burnt sienna so that it flows into that leaf shape. Then go back and get some cooler colors, maybe some cerulean, a little viridian possibly, so it's kind of a blue-green. And I'll just kind of pick up the back edge of this leaf and push my tip of my brush right up against this blossom. And then again, I'm going to soften that edge. I'll come in with my brush and just soften the edge of that green so that it just has a chance to kind of mingle and mix with the warm side of the leaf. I'll add a little bit of yellow ochre in here as well, but I want to get a little bit of cool out here on the tip of this as well. And because this was wet, that just grabbed that water, and that dark pigment just kind of flowed by itself right back into the leaf. So we're seeing a change go across here. And I want to pick up a little bit of orange possibly and just kind of come across, maybe a little bit of red, I don't know, just to warm it up. But then, and this is the first kind of foray into our negative shape. We're going to get some, I've got some royal blue, very dark, and I'll get a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange. Mix those two together, and you've got a really nice dark. And I'm just going to take, and this is still wet, this leaf shape's still very wet. So where I set my tip of my brush down, it starts pulling back into that wet leaf shape, but the blossom itself is absolutely dry. So I have the ability with this sharp point on my round to push right up against that blossom. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of hooker's green and ultramarine, which is going to give me a more of a green, blue-green effect. And I'll add some of that right in there. And you can see where I've created sort of a jagged edge for part of that leaf right up against the blossom. Now, I've got too strong of a transition here, so I'm just going to take some of this with the edge of this little brush and just kind of move it around. And I think I want to get maybe some raw umber, which is kind of an earthy color. Mix it with a little bit of that royal blue, and I can bring this leaf shape kind of right on around the edge of this blossom. And I'll just maybe soften that a little bit. And we'll get some more leaf shapes going here, but you can see how you can just work in segments if your paper's dry and just keep the one leaf shape wet and get the pigments to start moving around within that nice leaf shape. I'm going to get a little richer alizarin crimson mixed with a little bit of the yellow ochre, whatever I have in my palette here. And I want to get this edge a little warmer. And that whole shape is still very wet, so I don't have to worry about too much. I just kind of drop in a little bit of dry paint right along the edge, and it darkens. There we go. All right, now let's tackle, we'll let that dry by itself. We don't want to do too much. We just let the water kind of do its thing. We'll come over and work with another warmer leaf shape. And in this one, I did a few little folds, kind of like a flag flowing blowing in the air. It isn't a straight rectangle. It's got some undulations to it. So some of it will be cooler where it rolls into the shadow, and some of the tops of these rolling edges of this leaf shape will be a little warmer where they're in light. So we'll come back in and pick up some raw umber, maybe a little yellow ochre, and just kind of give the top edges of these rolled part of the leaf shape a little warmth, and then come back in with some cooler color, little ultramarine and whatever we have in our palette. And once again, we're taking the tip of our brush and pushing it in around this well-defined edge of our blossom. And then I can take a clean, damp edge of my brush and just soften and let that moisture grab that rich pigment and just telegraph it back up. And I'm just going to pull this right on across. And as this starts to dry, I'll come back in and introduce more darks and cooler colors to define where the dips are. And oops, see, that's too much. We're going to pick that up with a tissue and make it work. And as we get out here farther away from towards the tip of the brush or the tip of the leaf, we can drop in with the tip of our brush a nice dark, cooler color. And it gives that kind of random rolling effect you get with leaf shapes that are kind of free flowing. All right, that's still a very wet shape. And I'm going to add a little bit of orange possibly to this side, just to warm it up a little bit. And then we'll get some cooler color, just whatever we can get in our palette here, and get this where it drops down into this little dips here a little, so we get the folds appearing. I'll come back in and add more darks to this leaf, but we want to let this dry nice and soft at this point. So right adjacent to this is going to be another brush, another leaf, but we're going to lose that edge altogether. So we can go ahead and get more of a viridian ultramarine type tone mixed up in our palette over here. If you can see what I'm doing, we'll get a little bit of greens mixed in there with some ultramarine. Add a little sap green to that, but keeping it cooler. And this leaf is going to come out from underneath the other one. And then I'll just clean my brush, wipe off the excess moisture, and just create a soft, wet extension of that shape. And the pigment follows that moist shape across the dry paper, and it just moves right through. So I'm going to take a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with that ultramarine that's in there, and just let it run across the two leaf shapes so that they become kind of one shape, one big shape. We kind of lose that edge separating them. I'll come back in later and we'll add a little bit of dark underneath it, but right now we want to let that dry. So it's just very natural looking. And we've got another leaf shape that I delineated right here. And I want to keep that fairly warm. If you go back to the painting, I've got a nice warm leaf. The rest of them are pretty cool. So I'm going to use a little bit of raw umber and mix that up with some of the glaze from the leaf green that was in my palette. So it's a nice warm tone. And I'm just going to kind of come across that shape with a general wash that drops in an even tone. And again, I'm using the tip of my brush to follow the length of that leaf. And now, while that's wet, I'm going to get some Viridian, which has a definite blue-green cast to it. And I'm going to just drop that in on this side, which is away from the light. And it tends to cool off this shape on this side, whereas the upper side of the leaf stays warm. I can even add a little bit of raw umber, quinacridone burnt orange, and I can probably drop in some neutral shape in here that needs to be a little cooler, maybe ultramarine mixed with that. It looks pretty dark, but it's all water, so it's gonna dry very pale. And I'm coming along the edge of parts of this, just dropping in some of that wet mixture, which is mostly water, but it will all kind of flow and mingle and mix on its own through that shape and create its own little message, of variety, of warms and cools. And you never know exactly what you're going to get. Sometimes when it's really wet like this, you'll start seeing blooms appear. Other times it's just a nice transition and gradation from warms to cools. But you've got to allow and be patient enough to allow this to happen naturally instead of trying to force it with your brush. So just get in and get out, leave it alone, let it dry. Our temptation is to always want to be going back into different shapes and playing with them and adjusting them. It's better to let them completely dry, and then you can come in and put a shadow across them. You can lose an edge, you can soften an edge, you can do all kinds of things to interrupt the shape. But let the wash that you put down that's charged with a warm to a cool pigment, let that dry by itself and be completely dry before you try to touch it. Frequently, I use the expression get in and get out. Once that starts dropping down and seeping into the paper and the moisture and the pigment starts staining the paper, you have to let it completely dry. And that's really a fundamental rule of watercolor, because if you keep going in and trying to adjust it once that pigment has started to settle into the paper, it's like you're muddying up a whole bunch of different pigments, and it loses its luminosity. While we're playing with this, I'm going to go back to this first leaf we worked on. I don't know if you can see this, but maybe if I get something bring this up a little bit. I get another board in here to try to elevate this a bit so it gets closer to the camera. There, now you can see a little better. This is now dry, and it's created some really nice little edge striations within that. But I'm going to go back now and glaze over that with some other colors just to give it some additional definition. This is what I'm talking about when I say you've got to let it completely dry before you go back in and introduce anything further. If I tried to do this while it was still damp, it would immediately get muddy. But now I can come back in on this dry paper and touch it with some additional pigmentation and get some really fun stuff going on. I'm going to get really dark with some royal blue and some raw umber, mix it up in my palette and come in with a nice dark that really pushes in against that feathery edge of the blossom, and maybe get a little bit up in here. Clean my brush, push that damp brush towards this really dark deposit of paint, and that moisture that hits that just grabs that pigment and starts pulling it into the moist area, and it creates its own little painting by itself. And that's what we're doing, is we're creating a series of little paintings within shapes that have movement from cool to warm and warm to cool, and they'll get little blooms within them, and they'll start looking very interesting. It creates a tremendous amount of interest. This shape here is still soaking wet. I can't touch it.
Randy,
So
can you suggest a substitute for royal blue, please?
can I do what?
Suggest a substitute for royal blue, please.
Possibly Indrathine or Prussian blue. Any of those are very dark staining blues that have just a slight green tint to the blue, but it's a very dark blue. If you go to indigo, that's like nasty black. You don't want to go to indigo. That's too dark. This royal blue, Prussian blue, Indrathine, any of those are good substitutes because they're very staining, but they're also very, very transparent. Indigo doesn't have a lot of transparency to it. It's very opaque. So that's why I tell people to stay away from the indigo, because it just kills the painting. It just overpowers it. Whereas you can see the transition from the dark to the midtone within this leaf has a lot of transparency to it. So that's what you're after, is that ability to create transparencies. All right, so now let's start pulling some leaves away from the left side here. I want to get a little bit of warmth. We'll get maybe some raw umber mixed with some of that leaf green, or even if you don't have that, just try a little bit of yellow ochre. And I'm going to come down and just drop in this shape, and using the tip of my brush to create a nice leaf shape. Push that dark right up underneath, and I've got another leaf that's over here. So I've got two shapes. I let the edges run together so we don't really see where one begins and the other ends. But as I get up underneath this blossom, I'm introducing some more of that royal blue that really adds dark to this whole edge up against the negative shape. I'm just going to take my brush and drag some of this around just to really kind of soften and pull that dark up into that shape. I can take a little bit more of the ultramarine and create a little cooler leaf shape that comes out of that. And we don't really see where it started. We just see the outer edge of that leaf shape emerging from all that wet. Then we've got another leaf that's over here that's very, very, I'm going to make it very light. I can't do that because it'll pull this warm pigment over into it. So we have to let that dry. This is part of the patience that we need in really, letting these colors and these washes dry before we go on to the next step. So you have to be willing to jump from one place in your painting to another place and work on that where it's dry, and then come back to another to one of these leaf shapes that are slowly drying. All right, so I want to come get this leaf here. There's a leaf shape underneath this nice warm leaf, and it's going to be very cool. So now I'm starting to get down far enough in my painting that I want to really kind of preserve the cobalt blue effects. That's a chunk of something there, and I'm just going to come in with a very light blue and push in around my blossom here to, because I took a pencil and I delineated and defined the shape I wanted for this flower. But now that big blue shape is gonna actually turn into a cool leaf that's in shadow. I'll just continue working around that shape with some darker cobalt blue that just happens to be right here in my palette. And I'm just, this is more of this raw umber and ultramarine blue and a lot of water, but it's on the tip of my brush, and I'm able to push these darks up against that negative shape, and you'll never see that pencil line anymore because the darks are going to obliterate it. I'll clean my brush, and I'm just going to soften the outer edge away, of that dark that I just introduced. Keep cleaning and blotting my brush so that it just gets drier and drier, but it pulls that dark away and it leaves just a nice dark edge up against the blossom. And I can always take a little bit of ultramarine, maybe a little bit of raw umber, and just tickle right up into those little crevices where the edge of the blossom has these variegated shapes on the edge of their segmentation of their blossoms. But you see how that really defines that. We're going to end up doing the same thing up here, but I got to make sure that's dry. It's still wet. So this takes a lot of patience to be able to do this and to not jump into an area that's too wet. Sometimes you get really strange effects, and a lot of times you just have to let the water paint the painting for you. That's the beauty of watercolor, is being free to let the water paint the painting. And we've created some really interesting little striations and shapes on this leaf shape up in the upper corner. I think if you're a perfectionist, you're probably going to want to go and fix that. That's our tendency, is to want to always fix things. I don't know if you can see this up close. I'll try to get it closer, but it's got a lot of really strange little blooms and things happening. I'd rather just leave those and let that be part of the character of the painting. So having the patience to allow these things to develop on their own and sit back and watch them develop is really what is exciting about watercolor. All right, I've got a space over here. I think this is dry, but I'm going to take my heat gun and just give it a shot of heat just to make sure it doesn't run into that shape, because I want the adjacent shape that's coming out beyond this, I want it to feel like it's farther back, way back. And that means it's got to be very transparent and very pale, just barely there. So I'm just going to barely use a little bit of cobalt. I might add just a touch of green to that, but it's going to have a real transparent effect. But it'll be a defined shape of a leaf, and that's probably too dark. So I'm going to take and clean my brush. It's damp. I can actually pick up some of that pigment now. But you can see that that's a lot lighter than, and I'm going to down here on the, where it kind of dips out of the sunlight, I'm going to drop a little cobalt, or not, I'm sorry, not cobalt, cerulean blue into that, just to give it a cooler look. But we'll come back and darken this one and give it some more warmth later. While I'm up in this part of the painting, I've got a nice little shape that's kind of zigzagging out away from the blossom. So I'm going to introduce some really dark reds. I'll use some alizarin crimson, maybe a little bit of raw umber and some ultramarine blue. And then once I get that nice and dark, I'm going to add a little bit of sap green to that. There we go. And I'm just going to take my brush and just create a kind of a random little shape that and leave it alone. Regardless of what it looks like when you do it, just leave it alone. And then take some of this really cool transparent cobalt and just sort of start softening some of wherever it kind of disappeared down into the background there. I'm just It's going to kind of soften this, take a tissue, maybe pick up some of that. So it just kind of all disappears behind that blossom. But that dark now is working with these other leaf shapes to really help bring our attention to this center blossom. While we're letting that all dry, let's continue on down and start developing some of these really transparent shapes that are farther down the painting. We want to maybe paint around some leaf shapes. So up in underneath this one, I want to get a little bit of cobalt as a glaze, just really thin and transparent, and come in underneath this and create sort of a shape around these other leaves so that they're a little more defined. Clean my brush and just soften all of that so it just disappears. And you can even take a tissue and kind of blot some of the lower edges of that away so that you just only see the one edge where it's up against a leaf shape. And I'm going to come back in with some darker stuff, come up in here, create another. And I'm painting the background and leaving the lighter areas to be leaves that are in negative shape. There we go. We'll let that, and some of this dark pigment is just flowing into that wet shape, and we just let it go wherever it needs to go. I've got a little bit of a leaf shape here, so I'm going to get a warmer color. We'll get, where did I have that? We'll get a little bit of this teal color and create maybe a leaf shape coming out there, a little bit of cobalt added to that. We'll get just kind of erase the outer edge of this. Dry your brush and just use your brush to kind of wick up any excess pigment. So it just sort of creates a negative shape that starts to emerge. And we'll come back in here and maybe add a little bit of something shape behind this leaf shape. I cleaned my brush, wiped it off, and I'm pushing it up against this shape of pigment that I just dropped as a little puddle kind of behind these leaves. And then this is too dark. So I'm just going to wick some of that up and then take a tissue and just blot it. So all we see is just one corner of that shadow that's kind of emerging from, and we'll start developing some of these other leaves later. We'll let that dry and move to another place in the painting. I'm going to go back up to the top and we're going to start getting some darks going again. And in this time, I want to come back in with a really, we're on the lower side of this big white blossom. So we have to be really much cooler with our the pigmentation that we're going to use. So I'm going to get some of that royal blue and a little bit of raw umber and really kind of pop in around this hibiscus shape. And you can see just by using the tip of this brush, I'm able to really get some nice darks in it. But that's just a big puddle of water sitting up on top of the paper. Now I take a damp brush that's clean and I just tickle the bottom edge of that and roll my brush across these shapes. So it just kind of, and I'll come in underneath this leaf shape that starts to emerge. And then I'm going to take a little bit of orange or some warmth, and I'm going to drop a little bit of warmth in here in a couple spots while it's wet. And it'll just repel some of the cool pigment and it'll go dark on us. And I'm just going to step back and see what happens. And I've got to probably blend this right across this edge so that it's just more of a gentle blend of tone without a whole lot of definition. That's too warm there, so I'm going to make an adjustment. I'm going to go back and get some really dry royal blue and drop that in as a nice dark in there. Maybe adjust the edge of that, those little striations in the blossom segment. Pretty dark. And I'm going to get some sap green, which is a warm green, but add that to the royal blue, and I can really now get some nice darks over in here. And they become even darker than that. And I'm going to come in underneath this leaf and then clean my brush, kind of take a tissue and wipe it off, and then just feather this around so that I create a negative shape out of this leaf. And I can drop a little bit of water in here in a couple places, see what see if it starts blooming. And I'm going to bring this down towards the this other blossom, and you can see it's very transparent. I'm not trying to create a real strong dark edge. I'm just trying to create some tone behind this that is kind of a very transparent. It's mostly water. It's pulling some of that other pigment down towards this blossom, but I'm not giving it a whole lot of strength or saturation. It's very transparent. So we'll maybe get a little bit of Payne's gray mixed with the blue and the quinacridone burnt orange. And I'm creating almost a really nice dark. And I'm going to come back in right underneath that blossom with just some of that dark in there. Just a couple spots, not too much. Clean my brush, wipe it off, and then just soften the bottom edge of that. You can see where I actually touched this and it got a little lighter. I'm going to actually bring in some warm greens and just drop that in there in a couple spots. There we go. But that dark makes this blossom just pop. Now that I've got that done, I'm cleaned my brush. It's just barely damp. I'm going to come back in and soften this edge underneath this so that this looks like there's a bit of a shadow cast across these lower leaves shapes without giving them a whole lot of attention. All right, so now we will throw in a little bit of water in here. Bring this down. I want to get a little bit of a cobalt, transparent, very light glazed leaf shape that's coming out of this. There's a couple of these leaf shapes. They're just kind of little puddles of pigment. There's another one here. We'll just kind of create some shapes that are coming down. And I'm moving in with this mid-tone, very transparent blue around this lower blossom to define it. Clean my brush, soften, and just create this nice soft surround, pushing some darks up underneath this lower edge of this blossom. And because that's already damp, this dark pigment diffuses. It just kind of runs downhill. It doesn't really stick. It just defines that edge a little bit. I can always come back in and just keep adding a little bit of dark as long as my dark is drier than than what I used on the paper. And it just spreads out naturally and it doesn't really create any problems. So it's time to dry this a little bit so we can go back in now and start doing some interesting detail work. I want to have everything pretty well dry. So you're going to want to take advantage of this time to stop and maybe use a hairdryer to get your paper back to a pretty dry surface. Because once the paper is dry, even if you've got paint on it, you can paint right over that and it's like painting on a fresh surface. It doesn't muddy up on you. And that's what we want to preserve, is the transparency of this, to give it a real clean spontaneous and fluid look. So this is still kind of damp, but good enough. This is not even dark enough. As I don't know if you can see, but it's starting to dry. And as it dries, even though we used a lot of staining dark pigment, the water evaporates and you're left with something that's about, a third less dark than you thought it would be. So we have opportunities to go back in and really do some nice darks, but you can only do that when it's really, really nice and dry. So what I want to do now is create more of a loose fluid effect coming down the side of this. I've already defined a couple of little negative shapes here. And even if I glaze over those negative shapes will always be visible. So you don't have to worry about losing them. I'm going to take some clean water and clean my palette. Did everybody still see everything here? I want to get over here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm just kind of taking a big brush, wetting my mixing area, and then I'll take a tissue and I'll just kind of wick up all that excess stuff so I can get a really nice clean glaze. That's the next step. We're going to create a cobalt glaze that's very transparent, very thin, very diluted. And come back over here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And I'll take this big brush, make sure it's clean, got water on it. I'll mix up some cobalt and make sure it's kind of just a wet glaze. And I'm just going to kind of come down, and I'm pushing down pretty hard on my brush to give a dry brush effect, but that just cools off the paper a little bit. That's all it's doing. And I can even use the edge of my brush to create another leaf shape in there if I want. But you can still see those negative shapes. They're there. They're not going anywhere. And I can take my squirt bottle, and where I've got a couple of edges down here, I can soften those just by adding a little bit of water and let the water kind of diffuse that pigment and create a runny effect where it's going down. I'm going to add just a touch of bright violet. It's a very warm color. And I'm going to put some of that right in a couple of spots in here like that, just to where it's wet. And they'll kind of bead up. They'll create a strong edge and dry a little darker here, lighter there. Some of it bleeds over into the other wet areas. And that just contributes to that real wet, runny effect, which is a beautiful effect. I'm going to clean my brush and add just a little bit of the cobalt blue, not the bright violet. And I want to get just a little bit of cool up in here to create a negative shape for a leaf shape in there. And that does it. There we go. All right, so we got to let that dry. It's very wet. I want to come back in now and start really adding some leaf shapes on top of leaf shapes now that we've got this tone, undertone in there. So using my brush, this, what do you call it? This Perla synthetic brush, I can pick up a little bit darker value of this. Don't mix up where you have your glaze because that's all water. What you want to do is mix up a slightly drier mixture somewhere else in your palette. And I'm using it over here in the corner. And I'm going to come back in now and create a negative shape. There's a kind of a leaf shape right up against this guy. Maybe I've got a positive shape here. Clean my brush, soften the edge away from this negative shape. And then maybe add a little bit of viridian to this shape. So we've got some cool blues and then a little bit of warmer greens going into this. And they're just kind of all coming out from underneath the shadows there. Get a little bit more blue. There's a negative shape, see? And we'll just soften that. Whoop, I just lost my negative shape. Don't cry, just fix it. Okay. And I'm going to soften this. There we go. And we'll go back in now and get some darks. I'm gonna get, some burnt sienna maybe. And some ultramarine that makes it kind of a dark gray, but it's on the warmer side. And I can come back in and really pop in underneath some of these blossom shapes. And I'm just using the tip of my brush with a little bit of that pigment on there. Then I clean my brush, I rinse it, blot it so it's just damp, and I soften and pull away those little darks so that all we're doing is defining the blossom on the, and we're doing it on the underside, which is the shadow side, as opposed to the upper side where the light is. So I'm going to add a little bit of a warm sedimentary pigment here, raw umber, and just kind of giving a little more substance on the underside of that guy. I want to do the same thing for the upper blossom while that dries. I'm going to pick up a little bit of bright violet and some of that royal blue. It's almost a purplish effect. And I can really come in now with some darks underneath there. And they tend to really show up as darks now because everything else is dried. And it just makes it pop. Up here, I want to get just back down in this little area, this crevice here. I'll add just a little bit of dark, a little bit more dark over on this side, because we're pushing the darks into the edges that define the negative shape. Clean my brush, get all that dark off, just wipe it off so it's just kind of clean and damp. And then I can just feather away those edges so they become kind of a lost edge. Do the same down here. I can just kind of soften those edges a little bit. But that dark really makes those whites pop. And we're doing a little bit less of that dark down in the middle blossom. I'm going to use some more of the raw umber. And a couple of little brush marks coming away from the thing almost look like, leaf shapes. So we can make that work to our advantage. Put some darks in there like so.
What's the
What's that?
name of the color for the violet, please, Randy?
Bright violet. It's very transparent, very staining, and it's a brilliantly bright warm violet by Holbein called bright violet. I started off early in my career having to have a warm violet versus a cool violet. So I had sort of a purple color in my palette, which was a blue purple. And then I had a mineral violet, which was a sedimentary color. And that had some warm, kind of reddish violet tints to it. It wasn't very bright. It was kind of a dull earth color. It was sedimentary. Then I went to quinacridone violet, which got a little brighter. And then as I was out plein air painting with some friends, I saw somebody mixing up this lavender sky. And I said, how'd you do that? And they said, I used bright violet and I think they said quinacridone or phthalo blue. But anyway, that introduced me to bright violet. And I realized, wow, that's warm. It's brilliantly staining and transparent. It's not sedimentary, so it retains that brilliance when you, even in a watered down wash like you see down here. So I changed my palette. That's part of the evolution your palette goes through over the years. And so I now have my warm violet is called Holbein's Bright Violet. I think there might be some bright violets by Daniel Smith. I can't say for sure, but I like the Holbein Bright Violet because it's so staining and transparent and brilliant in intensity. It can really add some intense saturated color to your palette. It also mixes up beautifully with blues to give you these amazing purples and violets. So just a little side note there on what I have discovered is a really nice solution. So I'm going to add this leaf shape a little bit, make it a little darker so it goes behind that other one. We've got this leaf shape underneath that one, so I'm going to get a little bit more blue in here to make it darker underneath it and create like a shadow. And I'm just gonna give us a little bit of dark, give the impression that it's a shadow shape. The upper leaf is casting a shadow across it. Down in here, I'm going to add a little bit of warm quinacridone burnt orange with royal blue and just create maybe a dark shadow shape in between some of these leaf shapes. And they just get darker as they come towards the other blossom in the middle. All right, we'll let that dry. I'm just kind of building up my layers of cool in here to create a background color that's got a little bit more value so that these blossoms get defined. I'm going to use a little bit more ultramarine as I get up into here. Clean my brush and then push a clean brush towards that ultramarine, which is a sedimentary color. It's going to be very atmospheric, and it just kind of cools things off a little bit there with the blue tone. And I can introduce some of the royal blue with some raw umber to that and get it a little warmer on the underside here in a couple of spots. Clean my brush. And then just make a few little brush, leaf shapes that are coming out of that as it pulls away. Maybe take a little bit of warm yellow ochre just to break it up. Maybe we come across the top of this leaf shape with some yellow ochre and a little bit of cobalt. And I'm leaving these little puddles to dry naturally, because that really kind of adds character to all the little shadow shapes that are emerging out from underneath these negative shapes of leaves. But as I go farther down, I want to get more and more transparent. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more value right in here. Maybe a little bit right in here. Take a damp brush and just let water start kind of running downhill. My board's at a pretty good angle. Maybe take a misting bottle and just let it start running down. Take a bigger brush and get just a little bit of tone in here. Okay, we're going to let that dry. And that'll take a little bit of time for that. And then we'll start detailing. But it's important not to try to overwork this. The temptation is just keep painting and add more leaves, and that basically kind of overworks it. So at this point, we're probably in pretty good shape if we just leave it alone and let it dry. I'm going to come back in with a little bit of that bright violet, and change up the temperature underneath here, adding a little bit of the violet, a little bit of yellow ochre, and a little bit of maybe sap green. Oh, it's wet. There we go. And some of these little puddles where it collected, they start leaching some of the pigment from above and creating these interesting blooms. And I'm always of the thought that if you can get those to form naturally like this, so much the better. It's really going to make it more interesting. You start seeing kind of jaggedy edges. Just take a soft, clean brush and just soften some of these. Just use the edge of the brush to just kind of pull some of those pigments together, but don't try to introduce any new color. Just soften them. All right. All right, let's continue on. And now I think I'd like to get a little brighter, warmer spot right in here because we've got a lot of cool going on. So I'll take a big brush and I'm just going to get maybe some yellow. And I've got lemon yellow and I've got a little bit of that leaf green. And we'll just pop this right in here just to give us a dash of warmth across there. Doesn't need much. A little bit of yellow ochre as we get down in behind some of these guys. And I want to strengthen this up above here a little bit as well. We'll get a nice glaze and we'll just kind of come across here with a dry brush effect just to give us a little splash of color. I'm going to wick up, actually, I'm going to use the edge of my brush or the corner of my brush. I've got a big puddle here, so I'm just going to wick this glazing up so it doesn't mar that dry brush effect. I want to just leave that alone. But I've got this little nice splash of warmth going through this painting, and we'll get a little stronger cools down here once this dries, but it's still very, very, very wet. So we'll leave that till a little farther into the painting. The next thing we want to do is start addressing these two subservient blossoms. We don't want them as bright as the one above. So what I'm going to do now is make sure that this is dry. Be sure you take a dryer and you come in and you make sure that all the darks around those two negative shapes are completely dry because we're going to kind of pull across that edge with a shadow. And I'll take cobalt blue and I'm just going to kind of come across and just come right down into the pistil of that. And the same with this one. I want to get a little bit of a cooler color, maybe even a little bit of ultramarine in there. And then come up this way. And then probably take some of this green, maybe a little bit of blue green, and come across parts of that. We may need to come back in and darken behind it a little bit with some neutral colors. But for now, what we're doing is we're knocking down the intensity of these negative shapes. They're still there. They're still going to be readable, but we want to just very gently kind of introduce some cool shadow shapes across some of those whites. And I think what I want to do is get a little bit of something coming into this one as well. And we'll pull up a little bit of white. I want to get a little bit of ultramarine mixed with the bright violet. And we'll just come back in and make this a little darker, got a little bit of purple in there, warm violet with the blue. So it's not very intense. It's just kind of basically dulling that white down, but we still see the white. And as this dries, it'll lighten even further. So we'll dry that. See how that looks. So you can still see it. It's there, but we're going to come in darker behind it once this has got some shadows across it. Same with this guy down below. We're going to come back in with a little bit of shadow shapes in there like this. We'll come in and just leave that alone. Let it dry. And now the one up above, let's clean our brush and get some of this glaze that we've got over here in our palette and just very gently come across part of this almost like little shadows coming in and culminating down in the center of the flower. Maybe some comes up right above, right into here. And basically I took a little bit of the pigment that's dry here and just dragged it across that edge to kind of lose some of that definition. I'm going to pull some of this purple from this leaf beneath it right across that negative shape a little bit. And it just introduces ever so gently some very subtle shadowing in those blossoms. Same there. Just kind of tickle it a little bit. Doesn't need much. What am I doing here? I'm going to add a little bit of dark down in the center of that where it's wet, and we'll let that just kind of filter away. And now where this is dry, I'm going to come back in with my sap green and royal blue, and I'm going to create a little dark behind this guy. Clean my brush and just kind of feather away that edge with water so that it, and then add maybe some raw umber. What I'm doing is I'm helping make this a little more apparent, and I'll do the same up above here. I'm going to add a little bit of sap green and royal blue to get right in underneath this blossom in a couple spots, not everywhere, just enough so we see it, and then push some clean water up against those dark deposits of pigment. And then underneath this leaf shape, I want to get some nice dark. I'm going to mix up some raw umber with the blue, the royal blue. Where was I? And I'm just going to kind of just to suggest that there's shadow shapes in there that are darker, maybe a little bit over here, just a touch of it back up in there. Separate these two edges so one is a little darker coming out from underneath the other one. And then at some point we'll put some little sprigs of things coming off of this, but not yet. I just want to keep working around these negative shapes so we understand that these hibiscus blossoms are in shadow. I'm going to add a little bit of dark down in the center of this, and then pull some clean water towards that so it kind of trickles back up out of that crevice. There we go. And then the same with this one. We'll get a little darker, a couple spots. Then inside we'll add a little bit of dark down in the crevice. And I'm going to get some really rich green. I'm going to use Hooker's green and some of that royal blue. So I've got a nice blue green. I'm going to create a couple of leaf shapes that are coming out from underneath this guy. But then I want to immediately go back to a cobalt that's more transparent. Kind of lose some of the edges here in a few spots. Maybe even hit it with a half of a squirt of mist just to soften some of those shapes so they're not real obvious. It just sort of telegraph through and make us feel it. Now, I told you earlier I wanted to put some cobalt, cooler dry brush effects down here. So I'm going to get a little bit of cobalt, and I'm just going to kind of come in with a nice really loose shapes here. And we'll leave it about like that. I think that may be all I need. I'm gonna do that. We'll add just a touch of darks. And that's pretty wet, so it just immediately diffuses and starts filtering across that shape. Same here, I'm gonna just push some shape underneath this. Make these negative shapes feel a little more obvious. And then blot across some of them so they're not real obvious. They're just sort of vague and dry. Next thing I'm going to do is we're going to use our liner and come in and put in a few little marks to define some of these leaf shapes, just to kind of subliminally suggest what they are. I'll use my rigger, mix up a little bit of raw umber and a little bit of that leaf green, maybe a little bit of green to that. And I'll just kind of come back in and create a few little shapes that are reminiscent of, maybe there's a stem going down through the middle of these. We've got a shape coming out. It's just a suggestion of shapes, leaf shapes. We can always come back in and get a little bit of burnt sienna mixed with that and pop in some of the veins on a couple of these. Don't be too, just very subtle. And it just kind of creates a nice little suggestion of these leaf shapes. Try not to put your hand in the wet paint like I just did. And we'll let that dry. And then we'll go back into the blossoms and we'll put some detailing in there. So and I've got three negative shapes here. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of tone and come back over the one underneath these or in between them so that it looks like it's farther back and it will feel like it's a little farther back in space. And we'll leave the bottom edge of that negative shape white, but all we're doing is just adding a little bit of tone right up underneath these two edges to create a little bit of contrast. And it just is kind of a great way to create the illusion of things going back in space without being too obvious. And I'm going to do the same here with this one. I'm going to put a little bit of cool shadow across this leaf shape so that this one feels like it's standing out. And I might even add a little bit of warmth to the top of it. Might add a little bit of something coming down through this one that's a little harsh. So we'll just blot some of that up and doesn't need much. So I like that. And we got to make sure it's dry. We can do something over in here as well. We can take a little bit of this glaze and create what might be another leaf underneath this that's a little cooler. We'll go and get a little darker right up in the crevice here and just tickle that so that dark pigment flows down into this wet shape that we just created. And then I'm going to take some of my bright violet, mix it with a little of that blue glaze, and I'll have maybe another leaf shape there without actually even defining it. Just kind of give us a few little marks. I like a little bit of blue coming out of this. And I think at this point, we'll take some of this blue glaze. I'm going to get a little nicer, cleaner glaze. And I'm going to just splatter a few things on the paper. And then up above, I want to get a little bit of the maybe some alizarin crimson. No, I don't like that. We'll use the violet, the bright violet, and a little bit of the cobalt blue. And I'm just going to create a little bit of splatter in a couple spots there. We'll let that dry, and then I'm going to put a few little slash marks on here with a rigger that give it a little bit of loose quality to it. But you've got to get this stuff dry here first before we do that. I've got huge puddles of water just sitting on the surface of the paper that haven't really dried. And if it looks like they're going to be sitting there forever, just take a clean brush that's damp and you've kind of wiped it off so it's just damp. And you can literally wick up any of the excess water that's in a puddle to expedite the drying process. That way it becomes more evenly, more of an even shape, and it won't bloom, and it won't take forever to dry. And what happens is if you have a big puddle of water on the end of one of these leaves, inevitably you're going to drag your hand through it, and it'll make a mess. So it's better to just wick it up, let it dry evenly, and you're home free. So now we still have some areas up in here that need to be a little darker. I'm going to come back in and just put some dry brush shapes in here underneath this some of these spots, just to create some really nice darks that are rich and not too obvious. And I think it just really helps kind of punch up some of these negative shapes. And I'm just popping in a few little accents here and there just to kind of create some nice darks that are coming out from the shadows. Now let's talk a little bit about what we can do inside these blossoms. Let's put a little bit of bright violet and some of the royal blue to make a kind of a nice purple. And we'll get right down into the stamen here and clean your brush and push a damp brush to it so it stays dark down inside, but it gets lighter and lighter as it emerges up out of that hollow cup of the shape. And now you've got some nice darks that we can put some accents in. And I can go back in and I can add just a little bit more dark in a couple spots. Same thing here. I want to do a little bit more dark in these blossoms in the little hollow. And I'm always rinsing and blotting my brush and using the damp brush to move the pigment around while it's still wet. And that really kind of helps. And I'm going to just take the shoulder of this brush and drag it across some of these blossoms so that we just lose some of the clarity on the backside, like they're just kind of lost in shadow. We still see some of the leading edges, but we don't need to see everything. We just need to feel that it's there. And I can take a little cooler cobalt and drop it in so it cools off in those recesses. Okay, now let's go back up here and add a little more cool cobalt on the outer edges of these little recesses down into the center of the blossom. And we'll let that dry. And I'm going to take some gamboge, Indian yellow, whatever you might have in your palette, and we'll create the little pollen, what do you call it, stems that are coming out of there. And I want to get some darks in there as well. So I'm going to use my liner brush. It's a very sharp tip on there. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, there you go. And I'll get it wet, and I'll get some of this. I've used gamboge. It's kind of a warm yellow, almost an orangey yellow. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to put a couple of dots of this in, but it's just not bright enough. I need it. If you do one test and it doesn't show up, you're not dark enough. So we've got to come back in and get some more darks to go into that recessed area. So I'm going to get a little more dark in here like that. Same with this one. Rinse my brush, kind of tickle the upper edges of those darks so they're not real obvious. And I can actually drag some of that wet paint up into the blossoms to create little veining that you would normally see in this type of a blossom. Makes it kind of fun. All right, now we'll try again. We'll make sure that's dry before we try to introduce any of the light. And one thing you want to do when you take your rigger or your liner brush, you want to make sure that the paint you're putting on it is almost like oily dry. It's like it's got a viscosity to it that's almost like oil paint. You don't want to have a real wet bit of pigment on there because then it won't show up. You want to have a really intensely saturated bit of gooey paint on the end of your brush. So when you set it down over those darks, it starts showing up. And maybe we use, I've got another little trick here. It's called Wand Brilliant number 1. Maybe we use that. It's got a little bit more, what do you call it? Gouache in it. And it's a warm color, but it's going to show up against a darker, it's got a big blob on it. I got to be careful. But now you can see it because it shows up against those darker areas. Put a couple of those in. And that tends to work pretty well. Sometimes you can just think that'll work. We'll rinse that. And then we'll get a little bit of red. I'm going to use some alizarin crimson. And I'm going to just put some darks in here that are like the stamen. Just enough. You see you're painting up close, you'll be able to see these. It may not show up on the camera too much, but then I'm going to take a.
Can you zoom in on one of the flowers so that you can see what's happening? Thank you.
Oh, it all. I don't know if you can see. It's hard to see. But what I'm going to do next is take some really warm, like burnt sienna and a little bit of orange and bright violet. And we'll just kind of create a nice couple of little twigs of something coming out of this. Couple of little things like that. And just for fun, you could take a couple of little alizarin crimson and burnt sienna and maybe add a few little berries or something. Who knows what they are? It's that season. We get to have fun. Make some interpretive marks on our own. I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber with some blue and just create a nice little stems that are coming out of this that are makes it fun. And I think that works. We'll let that dry. I like kind of leaving this side of the painting a little bit clear, not too much information there. If you feel like you want to add a little something, I would suggest keeping it very, very pale, very clear, very light in value. I'm going to clean my palette, get all this dark out of here, and maybe introduce a little bit of a cobalt type wash or glaze. I'll clean my palette really well. And the reason I'm doing this is I don't want to muddy up this background. I'm just going to create a really very delicate tone that goes across with a big brush. And just use kind of a cool pigment, maybe add just a bit of the bright violet to that, not much. Add water, and then, maybe just something about like that. Nothing really overt. I'm going to wick up some of that excess and let it dry. It's got some little freckles of white in there. It's kind of like a highlight or sheen on whatever might have been there, but we'll leave that alone. And that dirty tissues. Let's get a clean tissue and wick up some of these watermarks that are there. And this would be a great place to sign. What color should we use? Should we use a kind of a turquoisey teal color with the blue in it? Let's try that. We can come back in here and just take my brush, take a little bit of that and come right down across my signature with a little bit of splatter. And that's it. So now you sit back and you kind of look at this as it starts to dry and you decide, do I need to make any adjustments to this? And I think every painting needs a little bit of adjusting. I have a brush that's a very short, half-inch wide, fairly stiff, flat brush. And I just barely get it a little bit damp. And I can come back in and I can soften an edge very easily. And you're just basically erasing the edge and softening it. And if there's a couple of places where you have too much edge defined in one of these negative shapes, you can always just erase a little bit of an edge. You can soften things so they're more delicate, more blending. I like the shape of this little light lavender type leaf that's coming down. Leave that alone. But some of these berries, they look good. I'm not disappointed with any of this. I think it looks pretty good. But you have to make the decision, how much of this do I want to soften? Is there anything that needs softening? Am I okay with it? I feel pretty good about how much contrast we have around this upper blossom. It is your dominant blossom shape. It's the largest one of the three. It's got the darkest and the greatest value contrast around it. We have many more lost edges, softened edges around these smaller ones. They're not exactly the same. This one's slightly larger than this one. This one's got slightly brighter blossom edge kind of peeking out into the light. This one has less light on it. But then as we get down into the bottom of this thing, everything kind of deconstructs, gets looser and looser, and it just has it falls away. And it keeps our eye up at our center of interest, which is up here. And we have a very definite place where we want the viewer to land, which is this larger blossom. So that's the plan that went into this, so that we had some, a definite route that we wanted to take to arrive at our destination. So a lot of these leaf shapes that come down, I've given them some sharp, pointy ends that culminate in a little bit of a darker exclamation point of pigment, so that they have a little punch to them, a little power point of dark on them. A lot of them have lights and cools within the leaf shape, so you feel like that is undulating a little bit and like a flag waving in the breeze. And all of those things go into creating a looseness that simulates these leaves and foliage that fall into the background behind a floral arrangement. But it's just a fun thing to try to travel through and develop as a painter in using negative shapes to create these leaf shapes and blossoms and get make things feel less important versus more important.